The glass of the penthouse shattered inward, raining diamonds onto the expensive Persian rug. Verrick stood frozen, his champagne flute snapping in his grip as the red lights of the demolition crew flashed against the night sky. Not demolition for a rival, demolition for him. Below, the crowd that had gathered for his triumph was now watching his humiliation. But to understand why the city's most powerful developer was watching his own billion-dollar tower get condemned on opening night, we have to go back 72 hours. Back to a small, snow-covered porch and an old man who simply refused to move. The wind in the city was biting, the kind of December chill that found its way through the thickest coats. Eamon sat on his porch, polishing the heavy brass object in his hands. It was a box sextant and compass, a surveying tool from the 1922, solid, heavy, and cold to the touch. The needle floated in the liquid dial, unwavering, pointing true north despite the chaos rising around it. A shadow fell over him. It wasn't a cloud. It was Verrick. Verrick didn't wear a coat suitable for the weather. He wore a suit that cost more than Eamon's house, tailored to make him look broader, taller, more imposing. He didn't shiver. He just stared down at Eamon with the look a boot gives an ant. "This is the final offer, Eamon," Verrick said. His voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. 2 million, cash, today. You take it. You move to Florida, and you let me erase this eyesore. Eamon didn't look up. He breathed on the brass lens of the compass and wiped it with a flannel rag. The smell of old brass and oil wafted up, a sharp contrast to Verrick's expensive cologne. "No," Eamon said softly. Verrick laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Look at this place. It's rotting. The wood is warping. You are surrounded by steel and glass. You are a cavity in my perfect smile, old man. By Friday, the shadow of my tower will ensure you never see the sun again, literally." "It's my home," Eamon said, finally looking up. His eyes were watery blue, tired but sharp. "And the property lines are clear." "Property lines are for people who can't afford lawyers," Verrick sneered. He leaned in, placing a gloved hand on the railing. The wood groaned under the pressure. "I'm pouring the final foundation wall tomorrow morning, right against your fence. If your house collapses from the vibration, well, accidents happen." Verrick turned and walked away, his shoes crunching loudly on the frozen snow. This was the moment. Verrick thought he was just negotiating with a stubborn senior citizen. He thought power was about height and money. But he forgot one thing. Eamon wasn't just a homeowner. For 40 years, Eamon had been the chief city surveyor. He knew every inch of this city not by its price tag, but by its geometry. And he knew exactly where the lines were drawn. The next morning, the noise was deafening. Jackhammers tore into the earth. The ground beneath Eamon's small Victorian house trembled. Dust, thick and gray like pulverized bone, coated his windows. He sat at his kitchen table, the brass compass sitting on a map spread out before him. The map wasn't digital. It was blue ink on linen paper, dated 1954. The coffee in his mug rippled with every thud of the pile drivers outside. He watched through the window as the massive concrete mixers arrived. They were pouring the curtain wall, the massive structural barrier that would hold up the 30-story glass needle Verrick was building. Eamon picked up the compass. He walked out into his backyard. The construction fence was pushed right up against his rose bushes. The workers were shouting, pouring wet, gray sludge into the forms. "Hey, you can't be back here," a foreman yelled, waving a clipboard. "Hard hat area." Eamon ignored him. He flipped the sight on the compass. He peered through the lens, lining up the edge of his chimney with the church spire 3 blocks away, a perfect, straight line established in the original city charter. He looked down at the needle. Then he looked at the wet concrete wall. It was off, not by much, maybe 4 inches. But in the world of structural engineering and property law, 4 inches is a canyon. Eamon smiled. It was a small, sad smile. He went back inside and called the one person Verrick couldn't bribe. By Thursday, the wall was cured. It was a massive slab of grey brutality looming over Eamon's garden, blocking the winter sun just as Verrick had promised. The house was in eternal shadow. Verrick was in his temporary office across the street, looking at the scale model of his tower. He was drinking whiskey, though it was only 2 p.m. He stared at the tiny plastic version of his building. It was perfect. It was his legacy. He remembered his father then, a small man who cleaned carpets for a living. His father used to say, "Keep your head down, son. Don't make noise." Verrick hated that memory. He hated the smell of wet wool and cleaning chemicals that used to cling to his father's clothes. This tower was the antidote. It was a giant middle finger to a life of being small. "Sir?" His assistant, Clara, knocked on the door frame. She looked pale. "What?" Verrick snapped. "We have a situation. There is a man in the lobby, from the city surveyor's office, and a police officer." Verrick rolled his eyes. "Pay the fine. Whatever noise ordinance we broke, just pay it double." "They're not here for a fine, sir. They have a stop work order and a demolition order." Verrick froze. The whiskey glass paused halfway to his mouth. "Demolition? The building isn't even finished." He stormed down to the lobby. Eamon was there. He was wearing a faded wool coat and holding the brass compass like a shield. Next to him was a city official holding a laser measurement tool. "What is this nonsense?" Verrick shouted, his voice echoing in the marble lobby. "Mr. Verrick," the official said, looking nervous but firm. "We received a credible tip regarding a boundary encroachment. We verified it this morning." "Encroachment?" Verrick laughed, but it sounded thin. "We are within the markers. My team checked it 3 times. "Your team measured from the curb," Eamon said softly. His voice cut through the air. "But the curb moved in 1998, when they widened the avenue." Verrick stared at him. "The original datum point," Eamon continued, tapping the brass compass, "is the church spire and the iron pin buried under my oak tree. I triangulated it, your foundation wall, the main load-bearing wall for the entire west wing, is crossing my property line by 4.2 inches. So," Verrick spat, "I'll buy the 4 inches. Name your price. 10,000? 50? "It's not for sale," Eamon said. "Then we'll carve it off," Verrick yelled. "You can't," the official interrupted. "It's the load-bearing wall, Mr. Verrick. You poured it as a single-tension slab. You can't shave 4 inches off a tensioned wall without compromising the structural integrity of the entire tower." Silence descended on the lobby. It was heavy and suffocating. "So, what are you saying?" Verrick whispered. The official adjusted his glasses. "Under City Statute 88B, specifically the Adverse Structure Protocols, you cannot maintain a permanent structure on land you do not own without the owner's consent. Since the owner does not consent, the encroaching structure must be removed." Verrick looked at Eamon. For the first time, he didn't see an ant. He saw a wall. "I will bury you in lawsuits," Verrick hissed. "I will drag this out until you die." "You can try," Eamon replied. "But the law is clear, and until that wall is moved, you cannot open. You cannot sell condos. You cannot even let workers inside." This is where the panic set in. Verrick wasn't just rich, he was leveraged. He had borrowed $300 million to build this. Every day the building sat empty, the interest payments alone would eat him alive. He needed the pre-sale money to pay the loans. If he couldn't open, he was bankrupt in 30 days. The negotiation happened 4 hours later in Verrick's office. The air conditioning was humming, but Verrick was sweating. $5 million, Verrick said. He looked 5 years older than he had that morning. No, Eamon said. $10 million. That is absurd money, Eamon. You can buy an island. Just sign the easement. Eamon looked at the check Verrick had written. It was a beautiful piece of paper. It represented safety, luxury, and ease. He thought about his cold house. He thought about the vibrating floors. Then he looked at Verrick. He saw the arrogance that was still there, hiding behind the fear. He saw a man who thought money was the only way to keep score. It's not about the money, Eamon said. Then what do you want? Verrick screamed, slamming his hand on the desk. I want my sunlight back, Eamon said calmly. He stood up and placed the brass compass on Verrick's desk. You built your legacy on the dark, Eamon said. You thought you could overshadow everyone else, but you measured wrong. Eamon walked out. The climax wasn't a fight. It was a machine. 2 days later, the court upheld the emergency injunction. Because the encroachment was structural and intentional, Verrick had been warned about the boundary dispute before pouring. The judge was merciless. The order was given. Verrick stood in the street, wrapped in his expensive coat, watching. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was hollow. The demolition crew wasn't using a wrecking ball. They were using diamond saws. They had to slice the western face of the building off, piece by piece. The sound was a high-pitched shriek, metal on stone. Sparks showered down like fireworks. As they cut into the concrete, the tension cables snapped with the sound of gunshots. The structural integrity failed. A large crack appeared in the glass facade of the 3rd floor, then the 4th. The building wasn't just losing a wall. It was dying. Because of the integrated design, removing the encroaching wall meant the rest of the tower couldn't support its own weight. It was a billion-dollar domino. Eamon stood on his porch. The dust was still in the air, but the massive gray wall that had blocked his view was coming down, block by block. A beam of sunlight, weak and winter pale, cut through the gap where the wall used to be. It hit the snow in his yard, it hit the rose bushes, and finally, it hit Eamon's face. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth. Verrick turned to his assistant. "Get the car," he whispered. We don't have the car anymore, sir," Clara said softly. "The leasing company took it an hour ago." The bank froze the accounts. Verrick looked at his feet. His Italian leather shoes were ruined by the mud and slush. He looked up at Eamon's porch. Eamon wasn't looking at him. He was winding the mechanism of his old brass compass, checking the needle one last time. It still pointed north. It always would. Verrick began to walk, not to a limousine, but to the subway station 3 blocks away. He walked past the pile of rubble that used to be his legacy. He walked past the reporters who were shouting questions he couldn't answer. He had wanted to be bigger than his father. In the end, he was smaller. At least his father owned his own vacuum cleaner. Verrick owned nothing but a debt that would last 2 lifetimes. The following spring, the lot next door was empty. The bank had sold the scrap metal to pay off a fraction of the loan. Now, it was just an open field of wild grass and mud. Eamon sat on his porch, drinking tea. The sun was fully on his face now. He picked up the brass compass. He didn't need it anymore, really. The lines were established, but he liked the weight of it. It was heavy, like the truth. He opened the lid. The glass was uncracked. The needle was steady. He had destroyed a man, he knew that. He had taken a titan of industry and reduced him to a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. He could have taken the $10 million. He could have saved Verrick and lived like a king. But then he looked at the sunlight hitting his floorboards, exactly where it used to hit 40 years ago when his wife was still alive. Some things, he realized, you just can't measure in dollars. This was absolute justice. But was it mercy? Eamon sipped his tea and watched the grass grow over the tire tracks of the bulldozers. Eamon protected his home and the law, but he chose to utterly destroy a man's life when he could have simply taken a fortune and walked away. Was this justice served, or was it just bitter revenge from a stubborn old man? If you were offered $10 million to swallow your pride, would you have taken it? Be honest. Let's discuss in the comments.